Hello everyone. Welcome to this digital learning platform of Department of Collegiate Education, Karnataka LMS. Today in this video, let us continue the discussion of As You Like It by William Shakespeare, the critical appreciation of comical situations we made in the part 1. So in the part first of this video, we have discussed comic situations in Act 1, Act 2nd, and Act 3rd. Prior to that, we saw that the comedy is a romantic comedy with the theme of love, and it's also a pastoral comedy as it deals with the shepherds and rustic life in the forest of Arden. And the comedy is known for Shakespeare's creations, Touchstone and Jacques, the finest comic creations, and the comedy follows the tradition of a comedy which introduces a conflict and there's a complication of the conflict and finally the resolution of the conflict to make the play denouement. Thus, it's a perfect comedy by Shakespeare as we have observed so far. When come to the Act 1, Shakespeare uses the technique of starting the play, beginning the play with the sad note of banishment of Duke Senior, and he contrasts it with the comic situations introduced later on. Particularly in Act 1, we noticed comedy is created out of wit, humor, and irony. As we saw an example where Oliver calls Orlando as low-born one or villain is an example for a comedy created there because he is the one who behaves like a villain. He is the villain in that part. Still, he recognizes or calls Orlando as villain. So here he fails to understand the villainy in him. So self introspection is something which is lacked in that part. And then in act first itself, we see Celia's thought of her father's death to make Rosalind get inherit the throne. Thus, her foolishness is evident there. And in the fight again, we notice Orlando defeated Charles, but he is defeated by Rosalind in her love by handing over him a chain as gift. And the preparation what Celia makes, it creates a physical comedy in the play also, where she prepares all her she says she would like to get all her jewels and wealth together before going to the forest. That means a careful preparation is made to flee into the forest. And Celia's confidence in owing Touchstone also has that kind of comedy where reflecting the skill of a woman in that part of in that era to persuade men to do certain things. So in the second act, we see Duke Senior's words of content in at the forest of Arden. He actually longs for what is not with him. He is in a way says there are difficulties in the forest also, but he is happy with the things he has. He longs for the missed things. Because he is not gifted with that life at the forest. He is originally from the court, right? Because he being a duke, he belongs to the court. But now he realizes that the country, that the forest has peaceful atmosphere. Therefore, he says, "Are not these woods cold? Are not these woods?" He says like that in one of the dialogues. Then Jacques is also actually happy to be at the forest, but he condemns Duke's attitude and criticizes pastoral life. And uh, King Duke Senior makes a universal statement of sweet are the adversity, just like John Keats makes in the 18th century, 19th century poems. In his poem, that heard melodies are sweet, but sweet are those are unheard. So similarly, the hardship of life makes life sweet or challenging is evident here. Then we in Act in Act second itself we have the instances of Rosalind's love, towards Orlando. Touchstone also recounts his past love, and he makes a parody of Rosalind's love as well as Sylvia's love. He criticizes the poems hanged on the tree, and Jacques' idea of encounter of two dog apes um, for the criticism of mannerism is another example of comic scene. Then we see third act there. Duke Frederick considers Oliver or blames Oliver for hating his brother. Here you find Duke Ferdinand does the same. He hates his brother Duke Senior and he banished him, but he condemns Oliver for hating his brother and he considers Oliver as villain. Here you find that he failed to make an introspection of his own position, right? That's a reflection here. Ironically, the author Shakespeare highlights that blind spot in his life. Then again we notice a parody of pastoral love sickness happens here with the example of Sylvius, and Oliver also hangs his poems on the trees, and Touchstone attacks on that, and Rosalind's attraction to those love poems is a question again by Celia, and Touchstone's lines, and Touchstone's example of wooing Adri is the example of practical love. Finally, Ganymede's offer of love cure to Orlando, and Phoebe's ill treatment of Sylvius for love. All these are different comic situations appear in act number 3. So today in this part of video, let's discuss act 4 and act 5, the comic situations and their an attempt to analyze them critically. Okay, in Act 4, in the scene 1 and 2, we see Jacques' description of Jacques as a melancholy fellow. He here also Jacques attempts to describe the greatness of melancholy. Look at the phrase, it is greatness of sadness, greatness of melancholy. We see there is a discussion between Rosalind and Jacques. Rosalind actually attacks Jacques for his oppressively melancholic ramblings, for being too much of melancholic. She attacks those extremity in behavior. She has a dialogue to say, those that are in the extremity of either laughter or melancholy are abominable fellows, and betray themselves to every modern censure worse than drunkards. Here, Rosalind actually speaks against such extreme behaviors, because in the last act itself, we are introduced to one such, that is Sylvia's extreme passion for love, and that was a criticism of fantasy in pastoral love. There, the reality of life, real love, is what's in contrast with that of the fantasy involved in pastoral love. Here again we find Jacques is in extreme melancholic condition, and Rosalind attacks that extremity in behavior. Thus, in a way, she attacks that Elizabethan mannerisms, people's mannerism, which involve some extreme behaviors. It's in a way Shakespeare's own satire on the affected mannerisms of the Elizabethan Englishmen. Some people who traveled across the globe used to carry some very erratic, very unusual behaviors. That kind of behavior, that kind of mannerisms are brought under discussion here. She therefore disapproves him with her speech. Um, she attacks that affected mannerism, and she also condemns, of course, in the last part, Sylvia's over devotion to Phoebe. Thus, those extreme mannerisms are attacked through Rosalind. But for Jacques, he has his own point of view. He considers it is good to be sad and say nothing as part of his philosophy of melancholy. He does not take her criticism as instead, he continues to be melancholic and defends his state of melancholic. For him, that melancholy itself is a good weapon, right? He considers that as a suitable one for his condition or the present world's condition, isn't it? He therefore stick to that, and he doesn't change his principle. So here, therefore, Rosalind finally changes her discussion with him, and he exits. Um, Even for Rosalind also, Jacques considers she is a composition of his sadness, but she attacks his affected mannerism with those lines of as um, just repeated. Then Jacques exists from the scene. But here also we find one example of irony, that Jacques' attack on Rosalind, that she is also sad or melancholic, is evident in her condition, because she is very desperate to wait Orlando, because Orlando was late that day. He arrived very late. Of course, we are introduced to the reason for being late, but still, since he was late that day, she took a provision to attack the concept of love in general. She makes a comment here that is very popular one in Shakespeare's play, that is, men are April when they woo, men are April when they woo, December when they wed. This is a popular line in fourth act, scene 1, line number 124 to 125, page number in 124 and 125. She says these things. Here she attacks that general nature of men, considering generalizing one thing here, that men are April. That means they use all the attractive words when they want to win the heart of somebody, but once they already wedded to somebody, I mean married someone, and they are in wedlock, there they lose that kind of appreciation or that kind of price, and instead they become like December, a winter December. Thus we find an attack on the general concept of love as she perceives is there here. Then again, a punctuality of Orlando, which is questioned here, is also led to the sincerity in love. So he assures her that he is sincere in love, and he is ready to do anything. Right? He says even he is ready to die for that. But she has a reply that no one ever died for love, but he says he is ready to do that. Thus, finally, it is love that triumphs over Rosalind, who is actually Ganymede in the scene, and she gives in to Orlando's love. Thus, here we find Orlando is able to win Rosalind again, or Ganymede here, win the heart of Ganymede, who's questioning Orlando's love. So thus we find, though Rosalind acted with reason, questioning that love, but she cannot at the end, that she surrenders to the power of love. Thus, the situation here is that in their discussion we find wit and humor that gives way to the comic effect. Then we find Celia's practical mindset, which questions such a love, that falling in love with Ganymede. The situation is comic because it's a love between a man and man. That is very rare thing in Elizabethan era. Ganymede is a man here, right? Attired in the man or male dress, isn't it? So because Rosalind is now pretended as Ganymede, he is attired in the dress of Ganymede. As a male, she expresses her love to Orlando. That was a point of comedy then. So anyhow, then thus the Act 4 provides its comic effect or comic situations through these examples of humor and wit. So let's move on to Act 5. In Act 5, we find the encounter between Touchstone and Jacques. There, Touchstone tells Jacques, the Lord, that he was a courtier, and he has court manners, and he represents that court life. But here we find mm, Jacques makes a kind of criticism again on the court manners of the courtiers, the people who belongs to the court. And Touchstone's manners are criticized by Jacques mm, by attacking the general manners or behavior of the people who belongs to the court. Thus, in his criticism, Jacques creates a comedy in this part. And then later on, we find Touchstone's meeting with Edry reveals another incident of comic situation, which adds to the comedy. Because Touchstone perceives Edry to be someone who can understand all his wits and expresses his verbosity and his high witty languages, but Edry is out of reach all of that. She could not understand what wits, what languages he was using. That would create a kind of comedy in the situation. So, thus, unreachability of his expression, not reachable condition for his thoughts, is a kind of comic situation there. And his description of her to represent the realistic love, his descriptions to description of love to her, that actually represents a realistic love, because his entire notions are against the romantic love of what Orlando has or Rosalind has. This description of his practical life and practical love is another example where the way he thinks creates comedy for the audience there. But ultimately, in a relationship between Touchstone and Edry, we notice it's a kind of bridge built between the contrasting lovers, because Touchstone, who has different manners, who completely represent the court life, and we have a completely country made a goat herd named Edry here. So she represents the country manners. So now there is a bridge is built between the court life or the court manners and the country manners. Thus it creates comic situation once again. And then when we enter the next part, Oliver's love at first sight is again another moment of comedy, because when he looks at Elena, suddenly his love blossoms and he falls in love with her and he expresses his interest to marry her. And a sudden transformation is also evident in Oliver, who changes from that wickedness to wiseness or wisdom. So he becomes a good fellow here. This sudden transformation creates comedy to the present audience. And we also notice Duke Frederick also changes from his wicked behavior to good manners. So it is to resolve the conflict. We see Shakespeare carries this plot here in the last act in order to settle the play and create denouement or happy ending. And Rosalind's magical power is also another example where a sudden turn up event create comedy, because she who acted as a Ganymede till then assures them some magical power, and she appears with that magic and solve everything, and there she presents a real identity of Rosalind. Then again, the taste of the Elizabeth audience is upheld here, that you can notice throughout the last scene. Maybe in the transformation, change in the transformation, change or transformation in the wickedness, like Shakespeare uses his agenda of forgiveness and reconciliation, because when they get transformed, others are given an opportunity to forgive them and reconciliate with them. Along with that, Shakespeare also uses that Elizabethan audience taste there. What is that? That is a taste for magical power. They have heard of magics and some mystery, some mysterious things. So that kind of flavor for that is upheld here by presenting Rosalind in a condition of a magician. She, as Ganymede, performs that magic and settles everything, and the wedlocks finally unlock the completion of the play. The whole 3 4 pairs of lovers come to the wedlock, and thus the play completes happily. So a happy ending is provided with the union of all the lovers. Thus, the play, which actually opened with the sad note, then presents the conflict of love, where Orlando is in love with Rosaline but unable to meet her, and the complexity happens with the exile to forest, and the complexity is further created with the disguised role of Rosalind and Elena, and then finally the settlement happens gradually with the transformation in the behavior of wicked people, and reconciliation and forgiveness provides the end to the play. Thus, the Shakespearean concept of comedy is well practiced through the play. Thus, we can conclude that the play has a very well structured plot and perfect characterization, brilliant poetry, and it therefore becomes one of the best plays of Shakespeare. That these concepts are practiced in Act 4 and 5 also, and it supports to the concept of comic genius in Shakespeare. Then also we find various comic situations presented here also, just as in the earlier acts, like using the wit, humor, and irony contribute to make the play a perfect comedy. Anyhow, so we have used the reference of John Russell Brown's Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing, and As You Like It, a case book, and we have Meshul Mangan, a preface to Shakespeare's comedies, and the Cambridge Introduction to Shakespeare's comedies. These are the reference books on this, and besides, I have given the link to the text As You Like It in the below. You can also refer to the text and also refer to the website where you can find further information about Shakespeare is available in the description below. Thank you for watching. See you.